British and the Americans refused to have those clauses included, because to agree to them would have been a retrospective admission of guilt of something that they'd done during the course of the war. It wasn't until 1977 that a protocol was added to that convention, specifically outlawing bombing attacks on civilians. The British government signed it. Your own government, and I'm not entirely sure of the technicality, it may be that it was never signed by the United States government or has not been ratified by Congress, but at any rate, not taken to be in force from Washington's point of view to this day, which makes this whole question really about the deliberate and systematic massacre bombing of civilian populations a live issue still. During the war itself, by the way, in the United Kingdom, there was a very, very vigorous campaign of opposition to area bombing. Questions were asked in the House of Commons and in the House of Lords. Bishop Bell of Chichester repeatedly said in the House of Lords, "We are fighting barbarians, why are we behaving like them too?" The Mass Observation Unit, which was a polling organisation in the UK that kept its finger on the pulse of public opinion during the war, kept on asking people in all around the country what they thought about being bombed and about bombing and whether we should bomb in retaliation for the attacks on us. And people in the cities that had been badly bombed, majorities of people in cities that had been badly bombed, said no, don't bomb their cities. And people in cities that hadn't been bombed at all said, yes, bomb them. And that's a very interesting fact about attitudes at the time. There was full knowledge of what was going on. If you read newspaper reports now, all the way through 1943, 44 and 45, you see that there were very explicit reports about what had been attacked, how many bombs had been dropped. There were headlines in the Telegraph newspaper, for example, saying, last night Dusseldorf and Dortmund and Essen received 60 Coventries. In other words, a bomb weight 60 times as great as had been received in Coventry in November 1940. So people knew what was happening at the time. The people who were running the country had read their Thucydides at school and university, and they knew the arguments from 2,500 years before and all the way through the great tradition of ethical thinking in the West. And so, in many ways, there are no places to hide, except behind the arguments that I very briefly alluded to and discussed at much greater length in the book about the military and industrial justifications that are proffered in defense of the area bombing. I don't think those defenses work, and I think, therefore, very serious question marks rise above that campaign. And the reason why it's relevant to discuss it today is because, although I don't think that there's much point in pointing fingers and calling people war criminals now after the event, or indeed impugning the courage and tremendous sacrifice that was made by young airmen in the war, who thought rightly that they were fighting a just war and that they had the support of the majority of their populations behind them. There's no point in that, but there is every point in trying to draw lessons from it for now, just when in our world we are beginning to find ways of trying to enforce some of these international instruments that were the result of the Second World War, like a human rights framework and like the protections of civilians in times of war, which, because of the kinds of weapons that we have now, is ever more important a question. Thank you very much indeed.
I'd like to thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for coming. Meine Damen und Herren. I'd like to thank the Goethe Institute for inviting me also. I think I too should respond a little to, that's to say, oh, my glasses on my head. They were here a second ago. Oh, you are so kind. Thank you. I'm sorry, this is not a throat clearing. It's not a plea for sympathy. I expected Dr. Ushrin to say something like that, and for Anthony to take him up on it, Professor Grayling, I should say. I think it's time, really, that we said, look, we have been, all of us, very impressed by the extreme seriousness with which Germany has accepted its post-war responsibilities and discussed them in public, in its own country, and in international fora. There is absolutely no reason at all to suspect that any reopening of this discussion, which has already been quite elaborately undertaken in Germany, even Günter Grass with his new novel, The Crab Walk, has broken a few things that were once taboo. There's no reason at all to suspect that Germany would become intoxicated by any vengeance, fantasy, or any grievance, or any spurious moral equivalence. There's nothing to apologize for, in other words, in the opening of this discussion, and all of us, British and American, I think, should have said this a long time ago. I very much congratulate Professor Grayling on a very lucid summary of his own book. That's not as easy to do, actually, summarizing your own work, as some people might think. And I know he won't penalize me for saying that much of the argument was, at least to some extent, familiar to some of you, even if not at the very elevated level at which he presented it, which enables me or frees me to propose a few ironic references to it. I was going to start where he ended, and I'll be brief, by saying that not only has this argument, I mean, Jörg Friedrich in his book Der Brand, is only the most recent in Germany, but this argument has been going on in Britain for a very long time, and did in fact begin, I think, rather to the credit of my fellow countrymen, if I may say that, during the war. Not just to Bishop Ralph Bell of Chichester, who raised the question in Parliament, as did others, not just Vera Brittain, whose extraordinary book on the subject is still very much in print and very much debated, but someone who I'm proud to say was a friend of mine, the late Tom Dryburgh. Actually, he died ennobled as Lord Bradwell, socialist though he was at the time a very important newspaper columnist in London, and in his column in the Daily Express revealed the case of a German girl named Hilda, who had been orphaned. Every single person she knew, not just all her family, everyone she knew had gone and been burned to death in a German city. And he opened his column with a big picture of her and the question right across the page. In 1944, I think, should we be bombing Hilda? And this was a live discussion in Parliament, in the church, in clubs and pubs and at places of work and in bombed cities. And it was right to have all these qualms and misgivings then, and if it was right to have them then, we don't need to apologize for having them now. Sir Solly Zuckerman, I remember reading it when I was quite young, very shocked. Lord Charwell's memorandum to Winston Churchill, saying, I think I've worked out how we could crack their morale. What we need to do is to find the working class quarters of the German cities, where the houses are packed closer together, and where we would get, as it were, as Americans would now vulgarly say, more bangs for the buck. We can really slaughter them in these working class quarters. Lord Charwell's the chilling memorandum to Churchill. Sir Solly Zuckerman, one of the other directors of this program of bombing, after the war wanted to write a piece about it, a reflection on it, for Cyril Connolly's great cultural magazine, Horizon. And he decided on a visit to Cologne, which was a city he'd had a hand in flattening. And he came back and was visited by somebody who said, well, what about the piece? He said, I can't do it. I can't do anything about it. I've seen Cologne now, and I can't write. He said, all I can remember is seeing the total destruction of the cathedral and seeing a human finger on the top of a pile of rubble, and I've got writer's block about the subject. But he said, I had a title at least. And the title was going to be On the Natural History of Destruction. Later annexed by the great German writer WWll, who Anthony also mentioned, who we were very privileged to have amongst us in Britain for many decades as a writer and a teacher. I stipulate, therefore, that I absolutely know what Professor Grayling is talking about. And the most haunting thing in his book, I think, is the one he didn't draw attention to, which is this. Bomber Command, and to some extent the United States Army Air Force, did this to Germany in the closing years of the war for one reason above all: because they could do it. They did it because they could. They weren't able to do it earlier in the war, when it might, who knows, I'm going to come to that, have made a difference. But by this stage, that was what they knew how to do, had built the equipment for, had trained for, had rehearsed for. They were going to do it. It's not unlike the very gruesome moment at the end of the first Gulf War with Saddam Hussein. Actually, I believe that that's one long war myself. I think it's been going on since 1991 and only recently been concluded. But let's call it the first Gulf War in 1991, where Saddam's forces were withdrawing from Kuwait, got themselves trapped in a huge traffic jam with a lot of other stragglers, as you may remember, in the Mutla Pass on the way back to Iraq. That convoy was bombed and strafed for hours, by American fighters and bombers who couldn't believe their luck, from aircraft carriers anchored not far away, including the USS Ranger. Why did they blast them? Because they could. They didn't blast the Republican Guard, more's the pity. They didn't take out Saddam Hussein. more's the pity. But they could do this to the Iraqis, and some Kuwaitis too. Well, we have to live with this. We have to be intensely serious about it. I had to go and give a talk at the RAF Club in London the other day on another matter, and I felt the qualm I always feel when I go onto the premises of the RAF, the picture of Air Marshal Harris on the wall,